the Audit and Governance Committee on Monday the 12th of June from the Walton Suite, Winchester Guildhall. The time is 6:30 p.m. My name is Councillor Margot Power, Chairperson of the committee. This meeting is live streamed from the Council's YouTube channel, and the recording will also be available after the meeting. Subtitles can be switched on, and advice on how to turn these on is set out on our website. Can I remind members to use their microphones, and can everyone ensure mobile phones are turned off or on silent? This is where I have an attack of guilty conscience. Did I turn mine off? In the unlikely event that it is necessary to evacuate the building, the fire alarm will sound. Please follow all the instructions given to you by our team. Turning to the agenda, we do have some apologies from Councillors Godfrey and Miller, and we have Councillors Bolton and Cunningham as deputies. Thank you very much. Do we have any disclosures of interest? None. Thank you very much. The next agenda item is to appoint a vice chairman. Do we have any nominations for that role?
Could I nominate Councillor Chamberlain, please?
Thank you. Do you have a seconder?
I'm very happy to second Councillor Chamberlain.
As we only have one name being volunteered for this role, Councillor Chamberlain is appointed as vice chairman. Is that agreed? Thank you very much. Would you like to come and join us, Councillor Chamberlain? Bringing your name tag with you. Thank you very much. The next agenda item is Chair's announcements. I have no announcements. So we then turn to the minutes of the previous meeting held on the 2nd of March 2023. These minutes are on pages 5 to 10 of your agenda pack. Are there any queries on the minutes, or may we accept them as agreed? Is that agreed? Thank you very much. I do have one query on the minutes from Mrs. Evans. There is a commitment to look at the complaint procedures update made at the last meeting. That does not appear on our work programme, Mrs. Evans. I don't think. Perhaps we could look into that when we get to the next agenda item. Thank you very much. The next agenda item is public participation, and we have nobody registered to speak. And then we turn to the Audit and Governance Committee work programme. Mrs. Keys, Mrs. Evans, who is introducing this paper.
Do you want me to step in there, Chair? It's a very brief covering report, which is just which has appended to it the upcoming work programme items for the rest of the municipal year. Clearly, we can be flexible on those agenda items, but this is setting out the proposed work programme items.
Do we have any questions on that work programme? Could I ask that
I was just going to point out that there is a duplicate item on there, item 6 and 11. The certification of the claims and returns is on there twice, so there's only one of those to come to committee.
Given the history of the last couple of years, do you think it's worth keeping them in two places? And could we also add the complaints procedure, please, Mrs. Evans, at a time you think appropriate to make sure we don't forget? Thank you very much. Is that work programme agreed? Thank you. We turn now to item 8 on the agenda, the Auditor's Annual Report, pages 17 to 48 in your report packs. Mr. Souter, would you like to introduce this paper?
Thank you very much, and good evening, members. So this is the Auditor's Annual Report for the year ended 31st of March 2022. It provides a summary of the audit, and the main aspect is to give a document that should be accessible to members of the public or wider stakeholders should they be interested in our main conclusions that we've drawn for the conduct of the audit for that year. We've previously reported to this committee key messages for the accounts audit, so we comparatively try and cut that down and just give a very high level summary. But in contrast, this is the report where we set out in more detail our views on the council's arrangements to give its residents and taxpayers value for money. So we give an overall conclusion and try and set out a high level message, and then we give the information about what those arrangements are in the appendices. So we pull that together from all the sources we've looked at through the audits, try and give a flavour of what the council's arrangements are, how it works, and therefore hopefully to give that wider audience some assurance about what you are doing as an organisation. So the key messages, we do confirm that we gave an unqualified opinion upon your accounts for the year we were looking back at. And we do confirm that we are happy with your arrangements to provide value for money for your taxpayers and residents. The document should be published by the council after you received it, and so it's a permanent record available on your website for anybody that should be so interested in trying to have a look and go back. And it's also accessible via the PSAA and the NAO, who try and collate a record of these across the year so people can compare and contrast different reports and the conclusions from the audits. So I don't plan to go through the entire report. I'm going to assume the members have read the details. Just to reiterate, so yes, we did give an unqualified opinion. We do think your arrangements are appropriate to provide value for money. And so on that basis, I will end my overview there and be happy to take any questions on the content that you may have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Souter. Members, do we have questions for Mr. Souter? Councillor Bolton.
Thank you, Chair. You mentioned the where you undertook to look at some of the assets in more detail on page 24 of this document and 6 of your report. Is there a programme required to look through more assets than just the 3 large ones that you picked? I just wondered what you felt the significance was and whether there could be other problems that you need to, look out for. Thank you.
Yes, we do look at quite a considerable larger selection than those 3 assets that we've talked about on this page. So these are just the ones where we've got issues to highlight in terms of where we felt there were differences in our judgment of value compared to the original ones that were put through the accounts, and then how they were resolved in terms of the resolution of the audit.
Any other questions for Mr. Souter? I do have a few. Thank you. Oh, after you. Regarding the valuations work, I have concerns about the 5,000 extra expenditure on looking at those valuations and how we can spend that money. Like 5,000 doesn't sound much, but it's money, and indeed time delay in validating an estimate, and which is basically a matter of opinion, when the only real test of the value of that asset is the market. I wonder if you could explain how we arrived at that, Mr. Souter. Thank you.
So I can very much understand your views, but our job is to make sure that the accounts are materially correctly stated. So we have to follow the international standards of auditing, which include one of the standards is specifically on how you value estimates, and so that's the level of what we have to follow. So while I can appreciate that you have concerns and perhaps you would rather we didn't have to look at things in that level of detail, at the moment I'm afraid to provide a compliant audit to meet the expectations of our regulators, that is what we have to do.
Thank you, Mr. Souter. I also note that on page 24, we had a double statement of rent. Now, I know that the interface between the property management, the estates systems and the accounting systems have not always been as we would wish. I seem to remember there were mismatches in the past, and I just wondered if Mrs. Keys could explain if we need to take any additional action in this area, or whether we need to make it the subject of an internal audit investigation.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, we do reconcile the financial systems to the estate systems. Obviously, estates are raising invoices for rent on the properties, and we do look at that in detail. So it's an unusual case to have identified that there was an error in the valuation of the asset due to overstating the amount of rent in the calculation. But I just want to assure committee that we do reconcile that regularly. But if it was something that you wanted us to ask internal audit to include on their programme, then obviously we would welcome that input.
Mr. Harvey, is that work you've done elsewhere in other councils?
Yes, we have.
And did the results of your justification, your investigations, justify the time and money spent?
You need to refer back to that specific review and come back to you on that one. I don't know off the top of my head.
Thank you, Mr. Harvey. I look forward to it. Councillor Bolton, did you have other questions?
Thank you, Chair. On page 14 of your report, one was just a question of, I've no idea what that means, which is the final line of the first paragraph that said reasonable at canvas step determine appropriateness of going concern basis of accounting. Forgive me if I'm just asking you to tell me something very basic, but I just didn't know what that meant. And I might as well just tell you the other question was, the following assumptions looked very optimistic. I wondered what you thought about that as well. Thank you.
Councillor Bolton, could you just give us the page number of the report pack? Because I don't know where we're...
Okay, so in the report, that is page 32.
So those final words, I should have edited out of this document. It should have ended as have agreed, have reviewed and agreed reasonable. That those last final words should have been cut out because that's part of our internal working paper that really shouldn't have got into this report. So I'll make the adjustment and send a revised version across. So on the assumptions, we have looked at the assumptions. We base the information, or you base the information based upon the information known to you at the time. We, in some cases, have the benefit of hindsight. In some cases, we don't. It depends which year we're looking at. But broadly speaking, we felt that the assumptions you were making in looking at the annual budget and looking at the projections going forward were reasonable at the time you made them. The arrangement that the council has keeps those updated on a very regular basis. When we take a look at the whole, if you get your assumptions slightly incorrect, it generally is not too long before you work that one out in terms of your financial reporting and you've made adjustments through. So it gives us a good sense of assurance here that you have a good process, but you also have processes afterwards that help you pick up if something hasn't been quite assumed correctly at the time you made the assumption.
Thank you, Mr. Souter. Councillor Bolton, are you? Yes.
Just one final one was the under the Public Works Loan Board loans, are they fixed or variable? So are things getting much more expensive for those loans, or are they fixed when we take those loans out? I just wonder what the position was because I don't know. Thank you.
The council's loans that we have, the finance that we took out for the self-financing of the housing revenue account. Yeah, we took out a basket of loans at the time, having worked closely with our treasury advisors, and they there's a cross section right across of expiration dates of those loans, and they're at various different rates, but they're all fixed rates for the terms of those loans. So the risk is to the council at the point of needing to refinance, if that's a decision that we take.
And when we took out those loans, the financial planning was over a 40-year basis, I think, which was the maximum term. It was a very interesting exercise, actually. So, thank you. Do we have any other questions, Mr. Souter? I'd like to just say a few words about timing, Mr. Souter. This won't be a surprise to you. It's now quite a long time after the end of this financial year that we're looking at tonight. This doesn't seem timely in terms of reassurance to councillors or residents. We return to this at every meeting, I'm afraid. Do you think there is any hope of improving the timescales we can meet in the near future?
I think there is hope, because the department and the select committee are very much looking at the issue at the moment. And I'm not sure if you've been following the select committee meetings over the past month or so, but there have been references to a reset. So potentially some solution. I can't tell you what that solution is. I'm not privy to whatever is being discussed. That may help us clear the backlog. But if nothing changes, no. So something externally has to change, because we can't keep doing the same thing and expect a completely different result. So we are very much looking and hoping for some external stimulus that will help us clear the backlog to get back on foot. And I would not disagree with you. The delays do not give a timely level of assurance to yourselves, to management, to the public that everything is okay or everything is not. And we very much agree with you. We want that help to try and get back on track.
At least we've all got the same target in mind. Thank you very much. The recommendations are on page 17, I think. I'm sorry, Nancy. Oh, Councillor Cutler, I do beg your pardon.
Yes, I was just wondering about consistency in the recommendations, because we're talking about the annual audit report is described at, and whereas in the recommendations it's described as a letter. And I wonder which it should be.
Mrs. Keys, thank you.
Yes, that is a very good point. Thank you, Councillor Cutler. Formerly it was called an annual audit letter, and it is now called the annual audit report. So it's the annual audit report that committee need to refer to this evening, please.
So, committee, are we looking at the recommendations on page 17? Are we happy to confirm our acceptance of the annual audit report for 21-22? Agreed. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Souter. We'll see you again soon. Thank you. The next agenda item is the annual governance statement. Mrs. Evans, I believe you're introducing this.
Yes, thank you, Chair. So I'm looking at the agenda item 9, which you will find on page 49 of the agenda pack, just to help and assist us. So the purpose of this report, it sets out the annual governance statement for 2022 to 23 and the proposed actions that will be undertaken during the coming year to address any issues arising. So, Chair, I'm going to do a quick précis as best I can. I don't want to take up too much time, but I do also want to give a little bit more detail because we do have some new members on the committee. So if that's okay. We've already talked and Liz gave some details of some of these reports and this report as training prior to the meeting. So the Council's constitution delegates responsibility to this committee to approve the annual governance statement, taking into account our internal audit's opinion on the overall adequacy and effectiveness of the Council's framework of governance. We've talked about risk management and that control. The report presents the annual governance statement for the years that we've said, 22 to 23, and it is for consideration by this committee. As I think Liz Key's already said, it's a statutory document. It explains the processes and procedures that are in place that enable the council to carry out its functions effectively. And this document and this report, it gives an assurance to the council and the stakeholders that good governance procedures and requirements are in place, and it is produced following a review of those governance arrangements by the corporate heads of the service and also by service leads. And this the statement includes an action plan to address any significant governance issues that may have been identified. So this annual governance statement has been prepared in accordance with the proper practices, and council has followed SIPFA solace in delivering good governance, the 2016 framework, and that is the most up-to-date guidance in this area. It is used as a valuable means of communication, and it does, as we've already talked about, it enables the council to explain to our residents and service users, council taxpayers and stakeholders that the governance arrangements and the controls that are in place, how they are managed, and the risks of failure to deliver its outcomes and priorities. So it is a really important document. The following issues were included in last year's 21 to 22 statement, these being records, retention and disposal. So ensuring the records, retention and disposal policy and schedule were refreshed and embedded into the organisation. Identified was programme and project management. So ensuring consistency in approach and methodology across the council for our programmes and our projects, which is very important right now as we embark on some of our regen projects, and the disabled facilities grants, ensuring the operational procedures and policy meet statutory requirements. So regular progress and updates have been provided during the year to members of this committee in our quarterly governance monitoring reports, and referred to this annual governance statement was an action plan which is updated in the Q4 governance monitoring report, and we're going to come to that after this agenda item. So there is still one action remaining relating to the programme and project management, but good progress has been made during Q1. And owing to the substantial progress that has been made, it is not proposed that we carry that forward going into the 22-23 annual governance statement. All actions relating to the disabled facilities grants, there's a huge amount of work has been completed, and therefore that won't be carried forward into the 22 and 23 annual governance statement. But the issues that have been identified as requiring consideration and action for 23 and 24, records retention and disposal, we're in the process of scoping out that work. It is a large piece of work, and I've just done similar from at the authority I've left, and we got through it, but resource was needed. So that will continue, and that's carried forward. The council's constitution review and refresh, that's something I've started working on, and I've been speaking to Councillor Becker, who's with us, with regard to a working group. And again, the review and those changes will be coming to this committee for us to have a look at. So that's in progress, and that's something that will go on. And complaint handling, review of performance, and dealing with these are customer complaints, so that's not conduct complaints, and particularly the stage 1 complaints that we're going to be having a look at. So accordingly, these issues are included in the 22 to 23. It's attached in Appendix 1 to the report, And there's a plan that sets out the actions to address these issues, and that's included in Appendix 2. And progress against these will be included in those future governance monitoring reports. So thank you, Chair. The recommendations will be found on page 49 of the agenda pack. I'll hand that back to you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Evans. Do we have any questions, Mrs. Evans, on this paper? I do have one, which refers to the document record retention and disposal. Is the de-pinking of confidential papers included in that work?
It isn't part of this work, but it is. I can report to this committee that it is something that there was a resolution of Cabinet that included that work was undertaken and started, and I can report to this committee that that has started, and we are in the process of going back over exempt documents, the pink documents, and working out whether we are in a position to disclose those. And I have been part of that progress and part of that review, and I can report that has started, but not part of this actual document retention as such, separate to that.
Thank you, Mrs. Evans. Members, the recommendations before us are that we approve the annual governance statement for 2023 as set out in Appendix 1 for inclusion in the draft annual financial report 2022-23, that the issues arising and proposed actions be noted, and that progress against the actions be brought back to the Audit and Governance Committee as an appendix in the quarterly governance monitoring report. Are we happy to agree those recommendations? Thank you very much. Moving on to the highlight of the evening, I think, agenda item 10, the governance monitoring report. I think we're going to have quite a few questions on that, so that I shall take those in sections. Mrs. Evans, would you like to introduce this report?
Yes, thank you, Chair. And this, as I've always said, and we do review this, and it goes through quite a lot of scrutiny. There's a lot of information in this report, and if I'm right, I think we have about 80 pages of information and progress that we report to you. So it's an overview of the key issues in respect of governance, and this is the fourth quarter that we're looking at, 22 to 23 of the financial year. So this report, it sets out a summary. Again, I remind us that it is 80 pages, but we try and make it as succinct. And one of the things that I am keen to do is see if we can reduce some of the information and not taking away what we need to see, but seeing if there is a way of making this document slightly more concise. But there's a huge amount of work that goes into this, and it is great that we can actually report this to you and that the committee takes it seriously. So we have the annual governance statement, progress against the actions included. In the 21, as we talked, we are going back some time, 21 to 22 annual governance statement, that's in Appendix 1. We have declarations of gifts and hospitality, and I always like looking at these. It can make an interesting read, but there's nothing that stands out. There were 7 declarations of gifts and hospitality made by officers in accordance with our employee code of conduct. To include, I will read it out because it's gifts of biscuits, chocolates and preserves. Members regularly update their register of interest forms during the period of January 23 to 30th of March, and there were no declarations of gifts of hospitality over a value of £50, which are those that need to be recorded in accordance with our policy. So we had none of those. Then we look at the internal audit assurance reports, and there's a graph I found on page 68. It shows the assurance levels of the completed internal audits that were included in the audit plan, going back 2018 to 2019 to the current year 22-23. And there's really good progress here, and I have to say, this is probably the first time, not that I'm reflecting badly on previous authorities I've worked at, that I can say that we've concluded, and again in the chart in front of you, there are no we've concluded with no limited assurance and no assurance. So all of those are, it's probably easier to say and more positive to say, reasonable or substantial. So that's really, really good, and really, really good news to report to this committee. And we look at what those audits were. User lifecycle and access management, that's IT, reasonable. Payroll, substantial, so that's encouraging. Main accounting and reconciliations, reasonable assurance. Information governance, freedom of information, and our subject access requests, substantial assurance. Accounts payable, reasonable assurance. Housing asset management, responsive repairs, reasonable assurance. And council tax, we have another substantial assurance. So those are really, really good for me to report. And I'm quite happy to sit here and go through that list. So again, held in the reports, internal audit management tracking, corporate heads of service, service leads, and executive leadership board. We regularly review the progress against management actions included in the internal audit reports, and that's something that we do, and we progress through and look at that quite closely. There's a summary table showing the status of the actions found in the quarterly report, and the management actions again are kept under regular review to assess what actions might become superseded or obsolete. To assist members understanding, an additional narrative is included in the table to provide a brief explanation of progress being made against overdue audit actions. There are some, and the reasons for the delay in the completion. There are 12 overdue audit actions, 3 being high priority. It is the same as reported last meeting. And further information relating to the current overdue internal actions are shown in the table that you can find on page 70 and page 71. I'm sure we may have some questions around that. I talked about disabled facilities grants in the previous report, and I can say that all of those actions have been completed, and they reviewed and updated the disabled facilities grant policy, and that is now and will become the public front-facing document. So that has been done. Information governance, the records management, again, all of that has been done, and we can report that we've succeeded with that. And then just looking here, policy sets out council's approach to managing. Oh, this is our retention. I should say this is the records retention policy schedule. We've got a draft and we do have an updated policy. That policy is going to the Executive Leadership Board, I believe, shortly, due to be considered. Once that policy is agreed, we will look at the scoping. Scoping has already started, and we will also look at the resources and the resource implication that will be needed to carry that through. It will be a priority. And then risk management, the council's risk management policy sets out a timetable for the committee to review the policy, and the corporate risk register is included at Appendix 4 of this report. And the latest formal review of that corporate risk register has already taken place by ELB, Executive Leadership Board, and that was carried out on the 19th of April, and I was part of that. So that has taken place, and I can report that it's finalised. Something that I feel, and it isn't just me that's done this, there's been a team effort. We were at the last committee meeting, we heard some quite concerning news about the outstanding conduct complaints, and I can report that we now have, as it stands presently, only 2 active complaints. They are both new, and we have closed 20 of those complaints and outstanding code of conduct complaints since this last report. So I'm really, really pleased to offer that progress to the committee, and it isn't just me, it's been a team of officers that have helped to get that work done. So the complaints that we have are new, and I don't think they are older than 4 or 5 weeks. So all of the old backlog has now been cleared. Thank you, Chair. I will hand you back.
Thank you, Mrs Evans, and congratulations on the number of complaints being down to 2. I think that's compared to where we were a few months ago, that is really a great achievement. And also it's so lovely to see no limited assurance on the internal audit report. So our congratulations to all the teams involved in those systems. Let's hope it continues for the rest of the year. Now, I think this is quite a complex paper with several exciting items in it. Could we take questions first on pages 65 to 69, if any? Councillor Bolton, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. The internal audit opinions, if I understand this correctly, appear to be that we're doing less and less over time, and that sort of concerns me a little bit, and I wonder what the reason for that is. I mean, at its peak, we were looking at 20 in 1920, then it went to 13, and now 22, 23 is 10. And if we look at less, we'll find less. And I wondered what the comment was on that, please.
Mr Harvey, thank you.
It just really reflects where we were at the point in time in terms of those reviews that have made its way through to final report stage. So the audit plan has been comparable. I'm trying to think when we reduced it, certainly for about the last 3 or 4 years. I think in 18-19 the plan was bigger, but we agreed with the management team that actually the plan was just too big, to be honest, and so we reduced it from, I think, 453 days down to 310 several years ago, so you wouldn't necessarily be comparing, but certainly we would look to, generally you'll get about sort of 20 to 25 assurance pieces throughout the year. And so when you receive my annual report and opinion at the next committee in July, you'll see the snapshot for the whole year. I think at the time of reporting at the end of Q3, there was about 63%, I think, of the plan have been delivered through to draft report stage, but I can give a verbal update in a moment on where we are if need be.
Any more questions on pages 65 to 69? We move on then to pages 70 to 71, where I will start. You won't be surprised, Mrs Evans, that it's partnership working, which seems to have been on our list for a very long time. I wondered if we were looking to resolve that by the end of Q1.
Thank you, Chair. We certainly are, and this is obviously a new area for me to get my teeth into, and I'm now fully there, and so yes, we are looking to get this one sorted, and we've started some work on this already. So I'm hoping again we'll have a good news story next time we meet, and we can put this one to bed. Thank you.
I think we'd all like to see the back of that one. Any more questions on pages 70 to 71? Moving on then to pages 72 to 77. Moving on then to pages 78 to 90, which is the internal audit progress report. Any questions there? And then we move to pages let's see, 91, the Code of Conduct complaints.
Yeah, go on, Chair.
That's all right.
I'm just actually going back to the minutes from the last meeting. I don't know if I'm allowed to ask you. The Denmead parish council sent a letter. I just wondered if we had any conclusions from that letter.
Please.
Thank you, Chair. I do have an update with regard to, again, the last report, the investigation report that dealt with issues, conduct issues at Denmead Parish Council. There was a letter sent. There was an action plan that was sent to the Parish Council that needed filling in. And it needed to then come back to us, and that is something that will be coming back to this committee. There has been considerable progress made already, but what is planned and what has been I've committed to, not by myself but also with the chair will be joining me and another officer of the council. In fact, it will be Matthew Watson, who's been instrumental in clearing that backlog of complaints, but also helping in dealing with Denmead Parish Council going forward. We are visiting their council meeting on the 21st of June, where I will be talking them through my expectation with regard to that action plan, obviously noting and reporting what progress they've made, and focusing my visits and any conversations that we have at that public meeting on action and progress moving forward. So what we don't want it to become is a tit for tat, going back over old ground conversation. We want to look at some of the positives. We want to give assurances and help where we can. Part of that action plan is agreeing mediation. So we'll be talking through that and what that might look like, and also training that I have committed to give. And so we will be discussing and talking and again, working a way forward. It will be documented, and we will bring that back to this committee to let you know what we've achieved, what they've achieved. Everything that I'm hearing is positive, and I certainly hope that the meeting will be positive when we get there. Don't we, Chair? Thank you.
Evans. Councillor Akbar, does that?
No, that's fine. Thank you very much. Thank you.
It does occur to me that this investigation has been a considerable cost to the council. It has also impacted other complaints against councillors which have not been resolved in the timely manner we would normally expect. And indeed, Councillor Bronx spoke at the last meeting about the effect on those being complained about. I had similar problems with Brighton Parish Council where there was an unseemly delay. I do wonder if it is practice to actually quantify the cost, both in internal and external expenditure of such a complex complaint, so that other residents understand how much of their money is being spent on addressing code of conduct problems in both in parishes and in city council. Could you expand on that at all, Mrs. M?
Yes, thank you, Chair. This is something that as our councillors, and not the new councillors as such, but will know that I came to this authority kind of inheriting the Denmead investigation and trying to finalise it. And unfortunately, I came from my previous authority where I had to deal with a very, very similar parish council in very similar circumstances where we had to go externally because we could no longer, as a council and a principal authority, resource the level of complaint and work that was coming our way. And it was similar. And what I was able to do there, because it was under my watch as such, it had gone on for 9 years previously, and I was there for nearly 5 years, and it was still continuing when I left, unfortunately. But what I was able to do under my watch was work out the hours of officer time and the cost to the council of dealing with those complaints. A lot of them tit for tat. Unfortunately, some of them, there was a thread of something, so that it was never possible to completely disregard. So every complaint that came in, and we had 19 up to 26 at one time, you know, coming again tit for tat, somebody would be complained about, and then as part of the rebuttal, you'd receive another complaint, which is very similar to what we found in Denmead. We did circulate through our governance committee the cost and the amount of hours, and in one given year, and talking about another council, but it's a similar comparison, we were looking at £126,000 in dealing with that particular parish council over a year. So it does add up, and it's quite unusual and for monitoring officers to go externally and to look at a parish council collectively. It is seen as quite extreme and unusual, but there has to be a point where you say, we can't deal with this any longer, and we do need to take that extra advice, and we do need to you know, get somebody else in who has that kind of independent you know, opinion, and they are independent. Again, if you're dealing with the same parish council for many years, there is an argument that there's almost too much history when the monitoring officer comes to look at the complaints and the names and the nature of complaints that tend to be very similar. So there is true merit in doing what was done here and what I inherited, and it is something that I had just done myself. Now, the difference here, in my opinion, and I'm hoping I'm correct, is that at Denmead Parish Council, everything that I'm hearing after that letter, Councillor Atchell, that you've asked me about, has been very positive, and progress has been made already. So that is something that I can report to this committee. But you know, we can do the maths, we can work out the finances, you know, roughly. It's slightly different because I've come into this at a later stage. But certainly going forward, we do time record here, no different. We use the same case management system, ICAN, as I did at my previous authority. We can time record, and we can work out how much of our time and resource a particular parish council is using and is taking up. So certainly we've spent this money on the report, and we are hoping that the recommendation of the action plan will help to improve things. We're hoping that training and mediation will improve things. The mediation is a cost that's borne from the parish council, that doesn't come from us. But certainly any training will be our resource, but I'm more than happy to do that. And going forward, it is something that we will be doing. We will be monitoring the resource and the cost, and you know, any involvement that we have going forward. And if we get progress and if we get, you know, a change in behaviour, I think we would all say, and hopefully say, it's money well spent. But if we're not getting the results that we are hoping for, and if we end up with the position not changing, then we will have to think about, you know, progress going forward and our involvement going forward. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mrs. Evans. I'd like to take a few minutes to think about this. It would seem it would be invidious to only count those costs for one parish council. But on the other hand, unless we know the cost for other sources of complaints, we have no basis for comparison. So, but I am very aware that a case like this can really impact the service we can offer to everybody. I'd be interested in councillor views on the possibility of looking at the costs. Should we consider that for all or just for this one particular very large case? The trouble is when you start, I think, Mrs. Evans, you don't know whether it's going to be a big case or a small case.
No, that's absolutely right. I think because we're starting, and I will mention it again because I'm quite proud of it and it isn't my work, it's the officers that have supported me, because we're looking at this now in a better position, we don't have a backlog, it's potentially easier for us to keep an eye on the resource of all of our complaints that come in, and what that entails, and whether you know, the subcommittee is needed, what the investigations look like, just how long an assessment takes. That is information that is potentially helpful, I think. So we're in a good place to start that, if that is something that the committee, you know, already reckon a rough idea of hours taken. You know, and also the time taken, you know, it's when we get these complaints, there's an assessment that takes place, we follow the guidance, we seek the opinion of the independent person, that's what we're expected to do, and we also get the version of events from the complainant and the subject member, and there are certain cases where we do need to ask for further evidence, and that might be going further afield. So even a simple assessment isn't quite as simple as it sounds, and some of them are more labour intensive than others. So it is something that can be measured to a certain degree, you know, to a degree of kind of accuracy.
Thank you, Mrs. Evans. I feel a recommendation before us that we ask Mrs. Evans to monitor the times and costs be recorded for all future complaints. Is there any debate on that recommendation? Is that agreed? Thank you very much, members. Thank you. Do we have any other questions on the code of conduct complaints? Councillor Gordon-Smith.
Well, sorry, I hope I'm not straying off the point here, but I mean, in court cases, they're normally settled, if it's a civil case, out of court, because no one can afford to fight unless they've got very deep pockets. And I'm just wondering, in this case, if you've got a squabble between two parish councillors, I mean, do they, the parish council gets hit with a bill at the end of it, but presumably they're quite happy to pay basically you to sort of spar on their behalf?
Generally speaking, I am doing the training for Code of Conduct tomorrow evening, and I'm passionate about Code of Conduct complaints. It's something that, as a monitoring officer, I could talk about all day. So I you know, just I apologise if I do go on, but I've had many years of experience, and I think many years as a litigator and a prosecutor, and many years for this authority, has kind of armed me well. Maybe I don't know, but there are occasions where, and what we would always try to do, and I would always try to do, if this is a silly squabble, you know, I would, and we would always try and deal with things informally. We are, you know, we have budget pressures, we have resource pressures. And one of the questions you will always ask yourself, me as a prosecutor, but also as a monitoring officer and as an officer of this council, is what is in the public interest? What, what is proportionate here for my time, my action? And we will talk about this, and it will be this committee that talks about this when we look at the sanctions that are available to us. Even when we do find a finding of breach, they are, as our previous councillors that I've worked with have called them, toothless. And again, it is generally, even after a full investigation and a day in court, as some people call it, and with a hearing and 3 councillors and officer time, the sanctions remain the same, and they generally end up being an apology, and further training. We do have censure, and we can talk about parties and leaders getting, involved, group leaders, to help with discipline, but also suspending from committees, maybe if there's a particular committee or relationship within a committee that's not working. But we are relatively limited, so I try to do as much as I can to informally resolve the problem. And I have not at this council, but at previous councils, I've had the whole parish council, including the clerk, in the room, bashing their heads together, and I've stood at the door and refused to let them leave until they had actually worked out what the issues were. It took many, many hours, but I can report that they did leave the council offices and they all had a drink in the pub next door. And that was years and years of infighting that was resolved, and for many, many years, and hopefully that behaviour will never come back. But you're absolutely right, we do try when we can to resolve things informally, and I will always try that. Sometimes the complainant is, really does feel that a formal process needs to be taken, and if you get, if that happens and both parties aren't willing to have a conversation prior to the formal process, then unfortunately, as the Localism Act states, I have to have a process and a procedure in place to formally deal with those complaints, and my hands are tied. But we do try, certainly, yes.
Thank you, Mrs. Evans. I believe there was a consultation on sanctions some years ago, which recommended something rather more forceful than the options we have before us nowadays, which was not adopted by government. Would councillors like to hear what those recommendations were? I'm sure Mrs. Evans could relate if you would wish to know.
Thank you, Chair. Again, I am passionate about code of conduct. I reported to our governance. We had a standards and a governance committee at my previous authority, and we were waiting with bated breath for these new sanctions that were going to come in from central government. The recommendations included suspension and a kind of docking of allowance. They included suspension from buildings, from premises, and again, it was just much more formal. Again, the hearings and investigations, because of those sanctions being stronger, would have potentially meant more work, but they truly gave us something that would act as a deterrent, rather than you're just going to get an apology and training. And it also talked about, and we do this here already, the naming and shaming and the publishing of these decision notices. But that is something that did come out of it. It was proven and believed that it was in the public interest if there was a finding of breach, and if the conduct and behaviours had fallen below what was expected, that residents and the public needed to know about that. And so that is something that has come from it, but that was as far as they were prepared to go. The statement from central government actually stated that it was felt that the local resolutions was successful and was doing the job that it was expected to do. So I had to report that back to my members of my previous authority after waiting with bated breath for something that we expected to be a lot stronger. We had the delay due to COVID. And well, first of all, we had Brexit, and then we had COVID, then we had Brexit, and then it was unfortunately, no. They felt that local resolutions were sufficient and adequate. And I have to say, I'm not inclined to agree. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I think those of us that have spent time on complaints meetings would agree with you. Councillor Ball.
I'd be interested to understand from you how you thought heavier sanctions would be enforced.
So the legislation as it is drafted does say that the sanction is actually a recommendation from me. That's the term and that's the language, which isn't hugely helpful, because if it comes as a recommendation from the monitoring officer or a recommendation, I would normally and usually get the backing of my committee, so it would be our resolution. I have had parish councils that have said to me, well, it's your recommendation, but we don't agree with it, and therefore we're not, we're not going to we're not going to put this to our committee or our council meeting, and we're going to fly in the face of it. We're not going to take any notice. And where that has happened, I have said, you can't have it both ways. You can't come to me and expect me to uphold conduct and behaviour and investigate your allegations if you're not prepared to accept the recommendation and our findings. And so it kind of fits both ways. But you are absolutely right. Had there been a suspension and had that have come in, we would have been looking to obviously committees, but we would also have had to look to group and party leaders to help with that and to help with the enforcement of that, because unless they had brought in new legislation to deal with that enforcement, it would have been very difficult, in all honesty.
Thank you, Mrs. Evans. Thank you. Any more questions? Councillor Cutler, thank you.
Sorry, Chair, if I don't mind commenting, but it strikes me with the lack of sanctions, the reporting of the costs is a sanction in itself, and along with naming and shaming. Certainly have seen evidence that some people were quite outraged in Denmead, even at the cost of the independent report of £20,000. We know that the cost was probably closer to 50 because the amount of work that was done internally. And so as a sanction, along with naming and shaming, I think it is important, given the resource constraints we have within the council, to monitor right from the word go. I know you've undertaken to do that because you never know which cases are going to escalate. And so you need to do it from the beginning, just so that you've got that ammunition perhaps for later on. I mean, it's unfortunate, and I got the impression from Councillor Gordon-Smith that he thought we recharged the parish councils. We can't, can we? And, so we are in this position, particularly with Denmead, with a council that has got a higher preset rate than we have, that they're charging their residents, and we can't recharge them for the cost of their own problems.
Thank you, Councillor Cutler. You are right. We can't. There's nothing in the legislation that allows us to recharge, But what you will find, and what we will come back to report on our action plan for Denmead, there are interventions that we've been asked to facilitate, and some of that is mediation, some of that is training from external providers, not necessarily by myself, and those costs are costs that will be borne by the parish council and not by us. So we can, with regard to that, we can get them to pay, and to be fair, they've offered to do that here as well.
Thank you, Mrs Evans, and thank you, councillors. I think we've given that a good going over. Shall we move on to the corporate risk register? Do we have any questions on that, please? Pages, I wrote it down in a safe place. Pages 92 to 101. Councillor Bolton.
Of course, this is one of the favourite topics for the Neils in the room. And in the spirit of conversations that Councillor Cutler and I have had about the way in which this risk register will evolve and will improve it with time. So broadly, coming back to this and looking at it after we've sort of put it to one side for a little while, it suddenly struck me that where we say the original risk rating, do we want to be saying the current risk rating? Because the current controls, they're not all of them are yet implemented. And therefore, the residual risk is still a residual after the implementation of the current controls. And so I sort of felt that at the moment, you look at that document and you can't actually put your finger on what the current state of risk is, or at least it's not necessarily labelled in a way that you can put your finger on it. And I just wondered, you know, I thought I'd throw that out there for everybody to have a think about.
A cumulative risk, and how maybe we don't summarise that as we could, but that is now shown on the top of the risk summary, how many we've got in the red quartile. Do you have a view on this, Councillor Cutler? I thought we'd got there, but I'm happy to be challenged on that.
I mean, I take Councillor Bolton's point about perhaps labelling, but the table suggests that they are current controls, and then so that should be the residual risk should be the current risk, and perhaps that is a better labelling that would be understood better. In terms of cumulative risk, that's something different, I suppose, in that it is a matter of what does it mean when you amalgamate the whole lot, and how much risk have we got there? What's the chances of two of them happening at the same time, and therefore, you know, sort of a far worse problem. That's quite a complicated calculation, I think, and it's a matter of unfortunately, I would think it's probably almost an instinctive thing. If you have got too many in that quartile, then the risks, the cumulative risk, must be increasing. So that is probably the only measure you can have that I can think of off the top of my head. But I'm willing to listen to as many ideas as possible on how we evolve, because we've always said, I mean, it's always been one of the key points about risk is I think way back 7 or 8 years ago, where the audit committee used to get a risk register every time and no one commented on it. And so we started interrogating it more, and then the whole thing, you know, it's the fact that it should be living and there should be changes. So if anything, the one thing that's missing here that's quite difficult for a committee or for any of us councillors to follow is if it's changed from the last time we looked at it. If more controls have been put in and the risk has changed again, we don't have that shown, I don't think. There's perhaps sometimes a description they've been reassessed. We don't side by side have what was it a quarter ago and have we changed it? So that may be something that could be considered as a mechanism to improve our understanding of risk, or understand that a dynamic process is in place rather than a sort of fairly static process. But I mean, I don't know if our auditors have a view on because from an internal audit point of view, you use the risk register to for the basis of what needs auditing, really. So it's important to know whether you feel that the risk register in itself is useful to you.
Yeah,
Instead of handing that over to someone else.
yeah, we certainly use the both the strategic and the operational risk registers to identify areas for potential inclusion in the audit plans, because clearly as a committee, what you're going to want the assurance from ourselves is that those risks are being managed and that the controls are operating effectively. So yeah, that is a key component of our work. What we'll say is we do see risk management across a lot of different organisations, and I think you compare very favourably compared to a lot of other authorities in terms of the, in terms of the frequency of reporting through to this committee, and also the level of information that you do receive. So it might not quite answer your questions, but as an outsider looking in and through seeing it in a number of other bodies, you do it a lot better than others. Not saying it's perfect, there's always room for improvement, but it is comparably good. And sometimes as part of the audit process, we try and add as much value as we possibly can do. And with risk management, you might be cited as an example of documents that are in the public domain that other authorities may want to refer to, where you defined your risk appetite and all of those things. It's a lot better than elsewhere.
Thank you, Mr. Harvey. Mrs. Keys, would you like to add?
Thank you, Chair. I was just going to come back to Councillor Bolton's original question, and terminology around risk management is difficult, and it's been debated at length at various committees. So just for clarity, the original risk rating column on our corporate risk register is there to identify the inherent risk, so the risk before controls, and then the residual risk is once those current controls are in place to mitigate that inherent risk, what remains untreatable effectively.
Please do, Constable.
Thank you for that. So if we're looking at this in a couple of years' time, would the original risk be the same all along? Or would that change? Because at the moment, we've only done it for a year, I think, haven't we? Is that right? Or does it go back? I mean, I only know it for a year. So, but not all of the things in the current controls have been implemented. So if they haven't been implemented, does that mean that the residual risk will improve as all those get ticked off? Or is the residual risk assuming that all of those controls are in place? You see, so when I looked at this, I pondered the same way as Councillor Cutler did, that, okay, so maybe the residual risk is the current risk, but that then means that all of the things within the current controls would have to have been implemented for that to be the case. And I can see from the list, when you go down, there's quite a number of those that are not yet implemented. So that's why it left me thinking, well, which is the current risk?
I think that's a good point. I mean, I just looking at it, board councillors being consulted was a case that arose today, wasn't it? We haven't quite got it nailed, and maybe we should identify those that are a work in progress. Councillor Bolton, this has been a work of continual development since I've been a councillor, and Councillor Cutler has been with us along much of that journey. So we are a lot better than we were 13 years ago. That doesn't mean there's not room for improvement. I just wonder if we'd like to assess those controls and identify those which are not yet in place. Would you accept that, Mrs. Keyes, as a sensible path?
Yes, Chair, I'm happy to take that away, and when ELB does our next assessment of the corporate risk register, we will certainly try and identify anywhere where we've had feedback that perhaps they are not happening as they should do. So certainly, Chair.
And as ever, and you know, I've said to Councillor Cutler before as well, and to you, Mrs. Keyes, that if I'm happy to meet and you know, and just give my 2 pence for you anytime.
Thank you, Councillor Bolton. Mrs. Keyes, please be very careful with your colour coding. We don't want to go there again, do we? We don't. Councillor Chamber. Oh, sorry, Councillor.
Thank you, Chair. I think the whole point, one of the points with risk management is that you can only ever take a snapshot. And so one of the key things is to really be aware of how things may change over time. And that was my point about it's really difficult to display how that changes in time. So when Councillor Bolton talks about some things that haven't been implemented, some of them have, but they're annual reviews. So obviously the risk will gradually increase until you get to your next annual review, because if it's a mitigation, it becomes less effective over time. But whether that matters should be again part of your assessment of it. But we can't put everything into there as long as those dealing with it are aware of those things. So having the discussion in this committee and having the discussion in cabinet if we at times as well, and in ELB and leaders board is just important to maintain that awareness so you don't drift back into, you know, we get continuous improvement perhaps, or maybe not, but with continuous updating if nothing else, rather than drifting back into it becoming a static and not very dynamic risk policy. So I think this committee's always done quite a good job of that, and we have had that continual awareness. And I think Anthony's point really is, and when I was chair of this committee in the past, and we met with other audit committees, and EY used to run a day where we talked about risk, and you know, half the councils had never heard of risk. So we can pat ourselves on the back to a certain extent, but we don't ever want to get complacent.
Thank you, Councillor Cutler. Any other questions, points? Councillor Chamberlain, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I guess building on the previous point, what occurred to me when I reviewed the risk was that kind of the cross-cutting element struck me as maybe not being there. So to give an example, one of the risks is cybersecurity. We've talked about records retention. One of the other risks talks about business continuity. So although the kind of the layered probability of all of those risks occurring is arguably less likely, the impact becomes more severe, i.e. if there was a cybersecurity attack, do we have the business continuity plans in place? What would that mean given our position on records retention? So I guess my observation was there's probably a cross-cutting view that needs to be taken to some of these as to how they're being addressed. And forgive me if I may, a very specific point that I observed as well on risk CR9, one of the controls proposed ITIL methodology, which from memory I think was launched in 2007. So there's a couple of areas that I observed there that maybe more up-to-date procedures would be a better benefit to the mitigations.
Councillor Chamberlain. Any further comment? Do we want to accept Mrs. Keyes' offer to identify any mitigation measures that haven't been yet implemented? I think that would be useful. Is that agreed? Thank you. What do we want to do about cross-cutting? Because I know there are some IT matters in one of the internal audit reports which have not yet been resolved. I don't think either of them relate to cybersecurity though. Mrs. Keys.
Yeah, there's a couple of actions there that do relate to business continuity, which is by its nature in IT intertwined with cybersecurity. And just for a bit of background, members will be aware that we have a shared service with our Test Valley Borough Council colleagues, which was a brilliant way to give us business continuity because we backed up all of our data and our systems with them, and they did with us. And if one of us was if the building was wiped out, we all had to work from somewhere else, we could stand our services up incredibly quickly compared to most other local authorities. Clearly, the environment in which we work now has changed with cloud storage of systems and the way that IT systems might be damaged. It's unlikely to be something taking out a building with servers in, and more likely to be some kind of cyber attack. So that's where we're doing lots of work to look at both our cybersecurity and the impact that that has on business continuity of our IT systems, and the knock-on impact of that for other services across the council. So there is a big piece of work going on in the background there.
Thank you. And when would we expect to see that completed or progressed, or at least milestones achieved?
Yes, so one of the outstanding actions is around actually doing a business continuity exercise to test the new processes that we've got in place. And I'm working with the team to make sure that that's delivered this calendar year. So we're hoping by the end of the year to have tested all of our new business continuity procedures.
Thank you, Mrs. Keys. Councillor Chamberlain, you acquiesced. Any other matters we wish to discuss on this report? In that case, let us go to the recommendations, which are that we note the content of the report, the progress against the internal audit management actions, and raise any issues with the Cabinet member. I don't think we have any issues to raise with the Cabinet member, but we have raised issues with officers, which we have noted, Mrs. Wren. Thank you very much. Are we agreed? Are we happy to note this report? Thank you very much for your time. That brings us to the end of the agenda. Thank you for attending this evening. Thank you to officers. Thank you to Cabinet members. Thank you to Mr. Harvey and Mr. Souter, who did get away early. I'm closing the meeting now, and the time, I think, is 19:52.